Probably from the dawn of time, people have been trying to understand the phenomenon of leadership and asking the question, what makes someone a good leader? When faced with these really big questions in the past, people often turn to war and religion to help them make sense of the world. One of the most prominent war figures across history has been Julius Caesar. He was a Roman general in the Roman Civil War around 100 BC. He was widely heralded as a political and military genius who was seen as strong and ambitious and perceptive. He was so influential over the masses that he eventually became a dictator. In religion, one of the most prominent figures across history has been Jesus Christ of Christianity. He's seen as compassionate and truthful and empowering and was literally sent down from heaven by God to lead the people. What these two men have in common is that they're great men. Regardless of whether or not you actually think they're great and support war or support religion, they are considered great men in the great man theory of leadership. It's one of our first early understandings of leadership from a more scholarly and academic perspective. Let's go back to London in the 1840s, around the time of Queen Victoria. The city was rapidly growing in population with industrialization and lots of socio-political changes. Enter onto the scene Thomas Carlyle. He was one of the most widely read and greatly admired philosophers at the time, who wrote a book about the French Revolution. And while that book helped him gain some notoriety, it did not help him gain a lot of money. He decided to start hosting lecture series. The lecture series was titled On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History. The lectures occurred in May 1840, and they were spoken to an audience. The notes were transcribed into a book that was then published and shared more broadly. The premise of this lecture series was that the history of the world is but a biography of great men. And although it doesn't sound great to our ears right now, it was a common belief of the time. And what this lecture series and his ideas were trying to do was differentiate great leaders from lesser leaders. Bert Allen Spector, an associate professor at Northeastern University, helps us understand what the great man theory is. The general premise of the great man theory, according to Spector, is that certain individuals, more specifically certain men, are gifts from God placed on earth to provide lightning needed to uplift human existence. It's speculated that this idea could have originated from those courageous warriors and wise chiefs that had been guiding history up until that point. Here's my interpretation of On Heroes based on Spector's 2016 work. The idea is that great men are gifts from God and it's their divine right to rule us. Downfall occurs in societies when an unable man is in charge as opposed to an able man. So we are supposed to find the most ablest and noblest of men and give them command over the people. Worship him and do what he says, bow down and surrender before these great men. And if we surrender ourselves to them, we'll find our welfare. By finding this most ablest and greatest noblest man, we will live in a perfect state in an ideal country. And you might think I'm being dramatic, but the quote from Carlyle's lecture is that we should bow down submissive before great men. That will allow the worshiper to feel himself to be more noble and blessed. So these men have to be pretty great to be talked about like that, right? In lecture 3, the hero as poet, Carlyle focused on Shakespeare, who was seen as having the greatest intellect at the time, and he was really highly regarded for plays like Hamilton and Macbeth for their artistic excellence. In particular, he was famous for soliloquies, which are basically monologues where the author is talking to themselves or a voice in their head out loud for the audience's benefit. Shakespeare was one of Carlyle's heroes. Lecture 4, the hero as priest, focused on Martin Luther, who was a German priest and the theologian who initiated the Protestant Revolution, and his beliefs became the basis for Lutheranism. In lecture 6, the hero as king, he focused a lot on Napoleon Bonaparte, a French general who eventually became the Emperor of France and whose military victories, political genius were celebrated, especially his role in the French Revolution. He built the Napoleonic Code, which revamped French's legal system, and obviously this awarded him a hero designation from Carlyle. Although a lot of people lack latched on to this idea. There was criticism even in the 19th century, shortly after his lectures occurred. Herbert Spencer, Leo Tolstoy, Ralph Waldo Emerson, those were some of the biggest critics, and they generally argued that leaders are a product of their time. They didn't like that Carlyle neglected to consider the times and what was going on in the world when they understood leadership and the great man. They thought he disregarded social and historical forces and ignored the material and mental state of society. So material being kind of how well off the society was doing in terms of the resources that it had access to and the extent to which poverty and disease and things were rampant, and then as well as the mental state of society. According to Spencer, who's on the left, the great man depends on the antecedents furnished by the society he was born in. There are forces behind a leader that push him to become a leader, as opposed to him just being a great man that emerges as a great man because he was great. Let's focus for a second on Tolstoy's critique in War and Peace. A researcher at the University of Denmark, Nico Mouton, reinterpreted War and Peace in 2019. In that reinterpretation, he talks about how Tolstoy basically argued that the great man ideology persists due to our biases in historical narratives. We focus too much on the man, the person, the face in charge of a movement, leading a movement, as opposed to all of the things that happened outside of that man to make the movement happen. So Tolstoy basically believes that collective action is the engine of history that pushes us forward. So all of the people working together, as opposed to just that leader that's pulling the strings and making things happen. In War and Peace, Tolstoy argues that great men's power comes from the time. So what's going on in the world around them. If there weren't conflict and strife, maybe these men wouldn't be so great. It comes from followers. Followers basically consent to being led and to making things happen. A leader basically only has power because followers implement their directives, otherwise that person wouldn't have power. And that great men's power comes from rivals. People on the other side also contribute to the conditions that set up whether or not this person is successful in their leadership, and the rivals also set up the conditions that either limit or expand the options that a leader has for how to act. The great man theory was reinterpreted in the 20th century by Sigmund Freud, who was a leader of the psychoanalytical movement in 1937. Bert Allen Spector, who wrote the 2016 piece that a lot of this presentation is based off of, argued that Sigmund Freud said the need for a single special leader was primal, arising from the drive for dependency and even love that people just naturally have. Freud argued that people have the strong need to feel belonging to a group, to have an authority to admire, and to feel just a sense of safety. So because of that, Freud argued we naturally seek a father figure, and that singular father figure is always male. Freud gave a couple of examples. The first is of the Catholic Church, where people are led by Christ, and the second is of the military, where people are led by a single commander-in-chief. There are a couple of other 20th century perspectives on the great man theory that I want you to consider. The first is from Edwin Boring, a professor of experimental psychology. He says, "Certainly there are leaders and great men who play important roles in human affairs, and these persons are, practically by definition, those who greatly affect the lives of others. The great man theory cannot be wrong. It expresses too obvious a truth about society. It is clear that men die having differed from one another in social effectiveness and therefore in greatness." The second comes from an article published in the Academy of Management Perspectives by two researchers from the University of Maryland. They state, "Regardless of whether leaders are born or made, it is unequivocally clear that leaders are not like other people. Leaders do not have to be great men or women by being intellectual geniuses or omniscient prophets to succeed, but they do need to have the, quote, right stuff. And this stuff is not equally present in all people. Leadership is a demanding, unrelenting job with enormous pressures and grave responsibilities. It would be a profound disservice to leaders to suggest that they are ordinary people who happen to be in the right place at the right time. In the realm of leadership and in every other realm, the individual does matter." All right, you know what the great man theory is, and you've heard some critiques and some support for the great man theory. Let's look at some 21st century examples. An example from business is Howard Schultz, who was the CEO of Starbucks and then was not. And then they brought him back to be the CEO of Starbucks and save the company from its imminent demise. And he's kind of now heralded as being the savior of Starbucks and a really influential leader in the business space. It's hard to deny the influence that Taylor Swift has had in the music industry, regardless of whether or not you like her music. She has been a force in our cultural zeitgeist, especially with the Eras tour. One could argue that Taylor Swift is a great woman of music leadership. And then even think about the TV, movies, other things that we watch in the media we expose ourselves to. Often there's a great leader that's at the head of the media. Marvel movies, DC comics, there are superheroes there, and we latch onto them. We latch onto this idea of a person that can come in and save the day. So I'm curious, who are some other great men and great women that have existed now and throughout history? One of the cool things about social science theories is that regardless of whether you totally agree with them and their assumptions and their tenets, you can use a social science theory as a pair of glasses and a lens through which you can see the world around you. And it allows you to interpret different people, places, events, things in different ways to help us understand them better. We can do that with the great man theory of leadership. We can put that theory on as glasses and look at the leaders around us and the followers around us and the situations we find ourselves in and think, how would the great man theory interpret what's going on? Someone who's used the great man theory as a lens to understand current events recently is Christopher Brown. In his article in 2011 published in Communication Monographs, Brown argues that we talk about Barack Obama as a great man. And when we talk about Barack Obama as a great man, it has a lot of other implications for how we understand and see the world. Brown argues that elite white men align Obama with other legendary figures. We talk about Barack Obama like a great man. We put him in conversation with other great men throughout history. And as a result of that, it implies a racial transcendence. Talking about Barack Obama as a great man frames him as symbolically representing a post-racial era. Brown argues that that resituates racism as historical. If Barack Obama's got ahead and he's this prevalent of a leader, it suggests that systemic oppression must then be obsolete, according to Brown, right? Because we've talked about him in terms of a great man. We've put him in conversation with other great men. How bad can systemic oppression really be? It affirms white elites' comfort with racial outcomes. So if a black man can get ahead like Barack Obama did, we don't need to amplify demands for justice because black men can get ahead. What Brown also argues is that when we talk about Barack Obama as a great man and we kind of worship him as having been a great leader, we imply that he's exceptional. So remembering in the great man theory, our great men are sent down from God. They're the one singular father figure. They're powerful and noble, more so than others, and we should worship him. When Barack Obama is a great man, that implies that other black leadership remains marginal. Remember, we are looking for our most ablest and noblest man because all other leaders are insignificant in comparison. So again, if we see Barack Obama as a great man, then other black leadership is marginal in the argument that Brown frames. So it's really interesting to think about how we can use the great man theory then as glasses to interpret all these different leaders. I encourage you to evaluate what are the strengths and weaknesses of the great man theory. Where is it particularly strong? With what leaders does it work well to analyze? With what leaders does it not work well to analyze? I also encourage you to consider how can the great man theory help us understand current events and other followership trends. At the beginning of this presentation, you might have been pretty off-put by the phrasing of the great man theory of leadership, but hopefully now you can understand historically why the great man emerged as our first kind of depiction of leadership and how this great man theory can help us better understand the world around us.